France did not fall in 1940 because it lacked courage, intelligence, or even the right weapons. But it fell because those weapons arrived when the war was already lost. At the exact moment German armor broke through the front, France possessed a fighter capable of standing toe-to-toe with the Messerschmitt 109, when yet only 36 aircraft were ready to fly. This is the story of how a nation built the right machine, trusted the wrong timeline, and discovered too late that in war being right is meaningless if you are late. If you want to understand how France lost the battle against time before it lost the war, stay with this story. In May 1940, France did not experience a dramatic, drawn-out defeat. It experienced something far more disturbing, a collapse that felt sudden, confusing, and irreversible. To outside observers, the fall of France has often been reduced to caricature, cowardice, poor morale, an army unprepared for modern war. These explanations are comfortable because they are simple. They allow history to move on quickly, satisfied that the outcome was inevitable. But inevitability is a lie we tell ourselves after the fact. When German forces launched their offensive in the West, France was not a nation asleep at the wheel. Its army was large, experienced, and deeply scarred by the memory of the First World War. Its pilots were not amateurs, nor were its engineers incompetent. What failed France in 1940 was not the absence of strength, but the absence of readiness at the exact moment. Strength was required. The speed of the German advance shattered assumptions that had shaped French military thinking for 2 decades. The war France expected was a slow war, a methodical war, one fought along prepared lines with time to mobilize, adapt, and respond. That belief was not born of ignorance. It was born of experience. In 1914, the war had dragged on for 4 years. In 1939, many believed the next one would do the same. Time, it was assumed, would be available. That assumption shaped everything. French planners believed they could afford delays. They believed modernization could proceed step by step. New weapons would arrive gradually, tested thoroughly, refined carefully, and introduced when fully mature. There was confidence that when the decisive phase came, France would be ready. The decisive phase arrived before that confidence could be justified. When German forces broke through the Ardennes and surged toward the heart of France, the shock was not simply military, it was psychological. The front did not collapse everywhere at once. It fractured, communications failed. Command structures struggled to keep pace with events unfolding faster than doctrine had prepared them for in the air. The situation mirrored the chaos on the ground. French pilots were ordered to contest the skies with a patchwork of aircraft. Some were modern, many were not. Squadrons were scattered, reorganized, replotted. Airfields were abandoned almost as soon as they were occupied. Maintenance crews worked under bombardment. Fuel, spare parts, and trained ground personnel became as critical as aircraft themselves. And yet, within this disorder, something deeply paramount is best. Not on paper, not in theory, but in actual combat performance. Pilots who flew it knew this. Engineers who tested it knew this. The aircraft was fast enough, strong enough, and armed well enough to fight on equal terms. But equality on paper means nothing when equality in numbers does not exist. As German columns advanced, the French Air Force found itself fighting a war of presence rather than dominance. Aircraft were not where they needed to be when they needed to be there. Even the most capable machine could not influence the course of battle if it existed only in small pockets scattered across a collapsing front. This was not the result of a single catastrophic mistake. It was the cumulative effect of dozens of decisions made in peacetime, each one reasonable on its own. Delays justified by caution, revisions justified by technical perfection, bureaucratic processes designed to prevent failure, but which instead ensured lateness. By the time reality demanded speed. The tragedy of France in 1940 lies precisely here, not in incompetence, but in misplaced trust. Trust that war would wait. Trust that there would be time to finish preparations. Trust that the moment of truth would announce itself politely with warning. War does not behave that way. As the front disintegrated, French pilots fought where they could, when they could. Individual engagements were often successful, Isolated victories occurred, enemy aircraft were shot down. But these moments could not alter the broader trajectory of a campaign already slipping beyond control. Orders arrived too slowly, information lagged behind events. The speed of the German offensive compressed decision-making into hours where days had once been assumed, and in that compression numbers mattered more than excellence. A handful of advanced fighters could not compensate for hundreds that were still missing from the order of battle. Quality without quantity could inspire courage, but it could not stop momentum. Each sortie became an act of resistance rather than a step toward recovery. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Battle of France. The nation was not defeated because it built the wrong weapons. It was defeated because it built them on a schedule that belonged to another kind of war. By the time France understood the nature of the conflict it was fighting, the window for adaptation had already closed. The story that follows is not about heroism in the abstract, nor about machines worshipped for their specification. It is about how modern war punishes delay more harshly than weakness, and how a weapon that arrives late can become a symbol not of failure in design but of failure in timing. Before France lost the battle in the air, it lost the battle against the clock, and that clock had been ticking long before the first shots were fired. The delay that doomed France in 1940 did not begin on the battlefield. It began years earlier, in offices, committees, and conference rooms, where war still felt distant and abstract. In the mid-1930s, the French Air Force was already aware of a growing problem. Many of its Viking fighters were aging rapidly. Aircraft that had seemed adequate only a few years earlier were becoming obsolete in the face of new engines, higher speeds, and heavier armament emerging across Europe. France was not blind to this shift. It was simply cautious in how it chose to respond. In 1936, the Ministry of Air issued requirements for a new generation of fighter aircraft. The specifications were clear and for their time ambitious. The new fighter needed to be faster, capable of climbing quickly, armed heavily, and able to operate from relatively short airfields. On paper, this was a recognition that air combat had changed, but recognition did not translate into urgency. The French procurement system had been shaped by hard lessons from the past. During the First World War, rushed designs and unreliable equipment had cost lives. In the years that followed, the priority became control, oversight, and incremental improvement. Nothing was to be adopted until it was proven safe, reliable, and standardized. Every decision passed through layers of review intended to prevent mistakes. What this system prevented was risk. What it also prevented was speed. Dewoitine understood this tension better than most, a skilled engineer with a reputation for innovation. He did not wait passively for contracts to materialize. He believed that France needed a modern monoplane fighter, and that waiting for perfect conditions would only guarantee failure. Using his own resources, he began working on a design that aimed to exceed official requirements rather than merely meet them. This initiative, however, placed him ahead of the system rather than in step with it. Proposals were reviewed, debated, and set aside. Concerns were raised about production feasibility, costs, and untested design choices. Each objection was reasonable in isolation. Together they created paralysis while Germany streamlined its aircraft programs. France moved forward cautiously, convinced that time remained on its side. Years passed. When approval finally came to construct prototypes, it arrived not as a leap forward, but as a concession. The aircraft that would become the Dewoitine D.520 entered testing in a Europe already sliding toward war. The pressure to deliver results increased, but the habits of caution were disappointing. The aircraft failed to reach its intended speed, falling short of expectations by a significant margin. In another system, this might have spelled cancellation. In France, it triggered further analysis. Engineers identified the problem, not as a fundamental flaw, but as a design compromise: radiators placed for safety and cooling efficiency. Radiators were relocated, airflow redesigned, and the aircraft's profile refined. These changes work performance improved dramatically with a more powerful engine, and further refinements, the fighter began to show its true potential. But improvement came at a cost measured in time. Accidents during trials, though not unusual in experimental aviation, compounded the problem by forcing repairs and redesigns rather than acceleration. The aircraft was evolving into exactly what France needed, but it was doing so on a peacetime schedule. By 1939, war was no longer a distant possibility. It was imminent. Orders were placed in large numbers, reflecting a sudden recognition of urgency. Thousands of aircraft were requested on paper, factories expanded. Production lines were reorganized, but industrial capacity camel by supply chain. Cooling issues plagued early production models, forcing engineers to slow output rather than risk fielding unreliable machines. The decision was defensible. A fighter grounded by mechanical failure is no fighter at all. Yet every aircraft held back for refinement was one not available when war arrived. The system was designed to avoid failure in battle, but it failed to account for failure caused by absence. A perfect aircraft that arrives too late cannot influence events. It becomes a promise unfulfilled rather than a tool of war. By the time Germany invaded in May 1940, the Dewoitine D.520 had proven itself technically. Pilots who flew it respected it. Engineers trusted it. But production had not reached the scale required to matter strategically. Only a handful were operational, scattered among units already struggling to adapt to a rapidly changing front. The delay was not malicious. It was structural. France had built a system open for careful preparation, not rapid response. It assumed that war would allow time for transition, for gradual replacement, for adaptation under pressure. That assumption had been valid once. In 1940, it was fatal. What makes this story particularly painful is that nothing about the outcome was inevitable. The people did not fail. The process failed to recognize that modern war rewards decisiveness more than perfection. Germany accepted imperfections in exchange for speed. France pursued refinement in the belief that it could afford to wait. History judged those choices harshly. The Dewoitine D.520 would soon prove in combat that it was not inferior to its enemies, but by the time it did so, the question it answered was no longer the one France needed resolved. The war was no longer about potential. It was about presence. And presence in May 1940 was something France no longer possessed in sufficient measure. The delay that began quietly in the mid-1930s had reached its conclusion, not in failure of design, but in the silence of empty airfields, where aircraft that should have been there simply were not. When the Dewoitine D.520 finally entered combat, it did not arrive quietly. For the pilots who first flew it in battle, there was no sense of disappointment or compromise. The aircraft responded sharply, climbed aggressively, and held its speed where older French fighters struggled. In the air, it felt modern. It felt capable. Most importantly, it felt competitive. This mattered more than any technical report against German aircraft that had dominated the early days of the campaign. The D.520 proved it could survive and win. It was not a miracle weapon, but it was no longer outclassed. In turning engagements, in dives, it remained stable. Its armament delivered decisive blows when pilots managed to line up their shots. The problem was not what the aircraft could do. The problem was how rarely it was there to do it. In May 1940, the French Air Force was fighting a war of dispersal. Units were constantly on the move. Airfields changed hands rapidly. Aircraft were shifted from one sector to another in response to emergencies that evolved by the hour. In this chaos, the introduction of a new fighter did not create a unified striking force. It created isolated pockets of excellence, small groups of D.520s. They flew alongside older aircraft, often tasked with missions that diluted their impact. Instead of forming a concentrated force, capable of contesting air superiority, they were used wherever the need seemed most urgent at the moment. Urgency, however, is not strategy. An individual enters. The results were encouraging. An individual rencontre. Pilots gained confidence in their machines. Word spread quickly through the ranks that this new aircraft was different, that it could finally meet the enemy on equal terms. But air warfare is not decided by anecdotes. While these engagements demonstrated the potential of the D.520, they could not alter the broader balance. German air units operated with numerical superiority, logistical depth, and centralized coordination. Losses could be absorbed, missions could be repeated, pressure could be maintained. France did not lack bravery in the air. It lacked continuity. There were not enough trained pilots to expand deployment rapidly. There were not enough spare parts to guarantee long-term operational readiness. Every victory felt local. Every loss felt amplified. The aircraft's very strength highlighted its weakness as a strategic tool. Because it was capable, it was pushed hard. Maintenance crews worked under impossible conditions to keep machines flying. Pilots flew repeated missions with little rest, aware that replacement air path might not exist. This was not how modern air power was meant to function. The Luftwaffe operated on a different logic. German fighters were not expected to win every engagement. They were expected to maintain pressure, deny space, and force the enemy into constant reaction. That approach required numbers as much as quality. France, with its limited pool of modern fighters, could not truly this model. As a result, the D.520 became a symbol of resistance rather than control. It could inflict losses, but it could not impose order on the sky. It arrived too late to reshape the operational environment in which it fought. This distinction is crucial. Wars are not won by the existence of capable weapons. They are won by the ability to deploy those weapons at scale repeatedly and where they matter most. The D.520 was never given that chance. Its deployment was reactive, not planned, not strategic. By the time French commanders recognized what the aircraft could offer, the conditions required to exploit it no longer existed. Communication between units deteriorated. Even a perfect fighter would have struggled under such conditions. A rare fighter had no chance. And yet this is where the story becomes even more tragic, because the limited successes of the D.520 demonstrated something unmistakable. It had simply arrived at it too slowly. The aircraft embodied lessons learned correctly, but implemented too late. Pilots who flew it understood this painfully. They were not fighting with obsolete tools. They were fighting with tools that should have defined the war a year earlier. Every engagement carried a sense of frustration alongside determination. The knowledge that the machine beneath them was capable, but that capability existed in isolation. This isolation was fatal. As the campaign progressed, losses mounted across all types of aircraft. Price and rates could not keep up. Even as production of the D.520 increased, the pace of defeat outstripped the pace of delivery. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines only to find no stable front left to defend. In this environment, numbers ceased to be an abstract concern. They became the decisive factor. A single squadron equipped with modern fighters could not offset dozens operating in coordination. Local air superiority meant nothing if it could not be sustained across sectors. The D.520 fought bravely in fragments, while the Luftwaffe fought as a system. That imbalance defined the outcome. By the time the armistice loomed, the Dewoitine D.520 had proven its worth in the narrowest sense. It had shown that France could build a fighter capable of standing alongside the best of its era. What it had not been allowed to prove was whether that capability could have altered the course of the war. The answer to that question was no longer available, not because the aircraft failed, but because it had been denied the conditions required to succeed. Its story in 1940 was not one of defeat in combat, but of irrelevance imposed by timing, a weapon too rare to matter deployed into a battle already slipping beyond reach. The D.520 did not lose the Battle of France. It arrived in time to witness it. When France signed the armistice in June 1940, the Dewoitine D.520 did not disappear. It simply lost its country. For many weapons, defeat marks the end of their story. Factories shut down, aircraft are scrapped, designs become footnotes. The D.520 followed none of these paths. Instead, it entered a second life, one far stranger than its first. The aircraft that had arrived too late to save France would now fly longer, farther, and under more flags than anyone had anticipated. As French forces retreated and reorganized, D.520s scattered across a fractured political landscape. Others were abandoned on airfields captured intact. A small number fled abroad, but most remained where they were, caught between defeat and occupation. The aircraft had survived. The nation that built it had not. Under the new political order, the D.520 was absorbed into a system that no longer viewed it as a symbol of national defense. It became a resource, something to be allocated, repurposed, and exploited. The same qualities that had made it valuable to France now made it useful to others. Factories continued assembling aircraft under supervision, turning out fighters not for a sovereign air force, but for occupying powers and allied regime. The irony was unavoidable. An aircraft designed to defend French skies was now being completed under foreign authority, its fate decided by those it had once been meant to oppose. For pilots flying under the Vichy banner, the D.520 represented a continuation of service without clarity of purpose. They flew missions, not against the original enemy, but against former allies. In the skies over distant territories, French-built fighters engaged British. These encounters were not defined by ideology. They were defined by obligation. Pilots fought with the same skill and discipline they had shown in 1940. But the meaning of their victories had changed. The aircraft performed as it always had. The context around it had shifted completely. Meanwhile, the occupying power saw the D.520 through a different lens. Captured in significant numbers, the fighter was evaluated, tested, and assigned new roles. It was not integrated into 5T combat units in large numbers. Instead, it was judged useful for secondary tasks, training, local defense, and familiarization. On paper, this made sense. The aircraft was available, capable, and did not require diverting production from demofisty designs. In practice, the results were disastrous. The D.520 was not a forgiving machine. It demanded precision, experience, and respect. Pilots trained on simpler aircraft struggled to adapt its cockpit fight. Its handling at low speeds punished mistakes harshly. Accidents multiplied. Aircraft were damaged or destroyed without enemy involvement. Pilots were lost not in combat but during routine operations. What had been a strength in skilled hands became a liability when used indiscriminately. The fighter that France had struggled to deploy in meaningful numbers now consumed resources and lives without delivering proportional benefit. In an unintended way, the D.520 achieved an outcome no one had planned. It weakened the forces that attempted to use it casually. The story did not end there. As the war expanded, the aircraft found new operators. Smaller air forces desperate for modern fighters accepted it eagerly. For them, the D.520 was not a compromise. It was an upgrade. It offered speed, firepower, and durability superior to what they had previously fielded. In these new roles, the aircraft demonstrated remarkable adaptability. It intercepted bombers. It escorted formations. Pilots learned to exploit its strengths and mitigate its weaknesses. Often with limited logistical support and improvised maintenance, the D.520 became a nomad of the air war. What united these diverse chapters was a single uncomfortable truth. The aircraft mattered more after France fell than before it did. Its longest service, its widest deployment, and its most varied combat experiences occur once it no longer represented French strategic intent. This is the paradox at the heart of its history. A weapon built for national survival became most useful when detached from the nation that created it. Not because its design had changed, but because the circumstances around it had. For France, this was a bitter legacy. The D.520 stood as proof that the country had not been incapable of producing a modern fighter. It had simply failed to align production, deployment, and doctrine with the pace of the war it faced. For others, the aircraft was a tool to be used pragmatically. It was flown until parts ran out, until maintenance became impossible, or until more advanced designs replaced it. No one invested in its future. They exploited its present, and yet, even in these fragmented roles, continued to demonstrate resilience. It absorbed damage. It returned pilots home. It survived conditions that grounded more fragile machines. Its structure reflected the care and caution of its designers, even when those qualities now served causes far removed from their original intent. The irony deepened as the war progressed. The aircraft outlived regime. Pilots who once fought against each other found themselves flying similar machines under different banners. The D.520 became a constant in a conflict defined by instability. By the time France began to reassert itself militarily, the fighter was already aging. New technophobia loomed on the horizon. The D.520 no longer represented the future. It represented a moment that had passed. But it refused to vanish quietly even after the war ended. The aircraft continued to serve. It trained pilots. It filled gaps in a rebuilding force that lacked alternatives. Machines that had been designed under the shadow of one war now helped prepare crews for another era entirely. This extended service was not a triumph, it was a reminder. The D.520 endured not because it had changed history, but because history had failed to make use of it when it mattered most. Its survival across so many air forces and so many years underscored the same lesson repeatedly. Timing decides meaning. In 1940, the aircraft was too rare to matter. In the years that followed, it mattered only because nothing better was available. The paradox is completed. The Dewoitine D.520 was never truly defeated in the air. It was defeated by circumstance, repurposed by necessity, and remembered as a symbol of potential misaligned with reality. And that misalignment would leave consequences far beyond the end of the war itself. The cost of delay is often measured in lost opportunities. In war, it is measured in lives. By the time the Dewoitine D.520 spread across multiple air forces, its greatest limitation was no longer technological. It was human. The aircraft demanded skill, discipline, and familiarity. Training takes time. Time was the one resource no one had. Pilots who mastered the D.520 spoke of its strengths with respect. It was responsive at speed, stable under fire, and robust enough to absorb damage that would have crippled lighter designs. But they also spoke of its unforgiving nature. Errors at low altitude or low speed were punished immediately. Visibility during takeoff and landing required experience and judgment. The margin for correction was narrow. For seasoned aviators, these demands were manageable. For novices, they were lethal. As the aircraft entered service beyond France, it encountered training systems unprepared for its complexity. Many pilots transitioned from simpler machines, accustomed to forgiving handling and wide safety margins. The D.520 offered none of that. It required anticipation rather than reaction, precision rather than instinct. Accidents followed predictably. Runway overruns, hard landings, loss of control during approach. Each incident consumed not only an aircraft but the time and effort invested in the pilot who flew it. In a war defined by attrition, these losses were not abstract. They weakened units long before enemy aircraft appeared. The problem was compounded by logistics. Engine required careful maintenance. Spare parts were not interchangeable with other aircraft types. As the fighter moved farther from its original industrial base, these challenges multiplied. Mechanics improvised repairs, components were salvaged for cannibalized to keep a handful operational. This was not a sustainable system. Every hour spent maintaining one aircraft meant another grounded. Every improvised repair increased the risk of failure. Over time, availability declined not because of combat losses, but because the ecosystem required to support the fighter no longer existed in full. The irony was cruel. The aircraft had been delayed in order to ensure reliability. Once deployed widely, for pilots, the psychological toll was significant. Flying a demanding aircraft without full confidence in its maintenance chain introduced a new kind of fear. Not the fear of enemy fire, but the fear of mechanical failure at the worst possible moment, when parts are scarce and repairs improvised. That trust erodes. Mission planning reflected this reality. Sorties were limited, aggressive maneuvers were avoided when possible. The aircraft's potential was curtailed not by enemy pressure, but by the need to preserve what little remained operational. In this environment, Even successful missions carried hidden costs. Each flight accumulated wear that could not be fully addressed. Each landing risked damage that could not be repaired. Pilots flew knowing that their aircraft might be irreplaceable. Not in theory, but in practice, this burden was the direct consequence of delay. Had the D.520 entered service earlier and in greater numbers, training pipeline could have adapted. Maintenance infrastructure could have matured. Spare parts could have been stockpiled. None of these systems can be built under emergency conditions. They require planning, repetition, and timeable fighter into a fragile asset. The human cost extended beyond pilots. Ground crews worked under constant strain, tasked with keeping aircraft flying, despite shortages and uncertainty. Fatigue led to mistakes. Mistakes led to accidents. Accidents led to loss of life, far from the front lines, unrecorded in combat statistical tallies or defeat narratives. They occur quietly, in workshops, on airfields, during routine operations, yet they shape outcomes just as decisively as air battles. By the later stages of the war, the D.520's role had shifted again. It was no longer expected to influence major campaigns. It filled gaps, performed secondary duties. In this role, its demands became both a liability and an advantage. For experienced pilots, it sharpened discipline. For inexperienced ones, it remained unforgiving. The aircraft's longevity was a testament to its structural strength, but also a reflection of scarcity. It stayed in service not because it was ideal, but because alternatives were limited. The delay that had defined its birth now defined its afterlife. Even after the war, the consequences persisted. Air forces rebuilding from devastation relied on whatever equipment. The D.520 continued to fly, training new generations of pilots who would soon transition to jet aircraft. Its demanding nature instilled habits of precision and caution, but it also required constant attention to aging components and dwindling parts. The fighter became a bridge between eras, carrying with it the legacy of decisions made long before. In retrospect, the human cost of delay emerges as the most enduring consequence of the D.520's story. Not the number of aircraft produced, not the victories claimed, but the strain placed on people asked to compensate for systemic lateness. With personal risk, pilots adapted. But adaptation under pressure always exacts a price. The Dewoitine D.520 was never meant to be a stopgap. It was designed as a cornerstone of modern air power because it arrived too late. It became a test of human resilience instead. That test was passed repeatedly, often at terrible cost. And in those costs lies the clearest lesson of all. When preparation is delayed, the burden shifts downward, from institutions to individuals, from systems to lives. The aircraft survived. Many of the people who flew and maintained it did not. That is the final price of being late. Counterfactual history is dangerous territory. It tempts us to rewrite outcomes, to imagine victories that never came, and to confuse possibility with inevitability. The question is not whether France would have won the Battle of France if things had been different. The question is what would have changed. Because change, not victory, is where the Dewoitine D.520 truly matters. By May 1940, the outcome of the campaign was shaped by momentum. German forces did not merely advance. They overwhelmed decision-making cycles. They forced reactions instead of plans. Once that dynamic took hold, no single weapon, no matter how capable, could reverse it alone. But that does not mean earlier readiness would have been irrelevant. If the D.520 had entered service a year earlier, in meaningful numbers, the air war over France would not have looked the same. Not because the aircraft was superior in every respect, but because it would have altered the balance of confidence, presence, and attrition. Even a few hundred modern fighters deployed coherently changes how a campaign unfolds. Air superiority is not about shooting down every enemy aircraft. It is about denying freedom of action, increasing losses just enough to disrupt tempo. The D.520, when it appeared in fragments, did this sporadically. Had it been present consistently, it could have imposed friction on German operations. At a critical moment, German armored thrusts relied heavily on air support and reconnaissance, and hesitation, even briefly, matters when a campaign depends on speed. This is where timing becomes decisive. Had the D.520 been available in late 1939, pilots could have trained on it properly. Maintenance crews could have mastered its systems. Spare parts could have been distributed. Squadrons could have been organized around it rather than absorbing it piecemeal. None of this guarantees success, but all of it increases resilience. The most plausible impact of earlier readiness is not a French victory but a longer battle. A battle that unfolds over weeks instead of collapsing in days. A battle that allows for adaptation rather than shock. In wartime itself is a strategic resource. France did not lack courage in 1940. It lacked time to recover from surprise. A stronger air defense, anchored by modern fighters deployed at scale, could have bought that time. German losses would have increased. Air support for fast-moving ground units would have faced greater resistance. Momentum might have slowed, and once momentum slows, options reopen. This does not mean the Ardennes breakthrough would have failed outright. It means its consequences might have been less catastrophic. Even small disruptions can cascade when a campaign is finely balanced. The D.520 was not a miracle solution, but it was precisely the kind of tool needed to exploit such foramies. What matters most is not the hypothetical end state, but the path taken to reach it. Earlier readiness shifts responsibility upward. It moves failure away from pilots improvising under fire and back toward institutions making choices in peacetime. And that is the uncomfortable lesson. France's defeat was not sealed by one wrong decision, but by a pattern of decisions that treated time as flexible, the belief that modernization could prove fatally outdated. The D.520 exposes this belief with unusual clarity. Its design shows foresight. Its performance shows competence. Its deployment shows delay. If it had been ready earlier, France would not have magically escaped history, but it would have faced it differently, with fewer improvisations, with fewer individuals asked to compensate for systemic lateness. Counterfactuals are often dismissed as idle speculation. In this case, they serve a different purpose. They illuminate responsibility. They show that the gap between what was built and what was needed was not technocratical but temporal. The tragedy of the Dewoitine D.520 is not that it failed to change the war. It is that it arrived just late enough to prove it might have. By the time France realized the kind of war it was fighting, the opportunity to adapt had already closed. The aircraft that embodied that realization was left to fight in fragments, for causes it was never meant to serve it. It offers warnings. The D.520 is one of them, not a warning about weakness, a warning about delay. The story of the Dewoitine D.520 does not end in defeat. It ends in understanding. France did not lose in 1940 because it failed to imagine the future of air combat. The aircraft itself proves that it was fast enough, strong enough, lethal enough. In the hands of trained pilots, it could fight the best fighters of its time. What France failed to do was align that vision with reality. The D.520 stands as evidence that modern war does not reward those who are merely correct. It rewards those who are ready at the exact moment readiness becomes decisive. In 1940, that moment passed before France could act on what it already knew. The aircraft arrived just late enough to reveal the truth without being able to change it. That is why its legacy feels so unsettling. It is not the story of a flawed design or an impossible task. It is the story of a system that trusted time it did not possess, a system that believed preparation could be gradual in a world that no longer allowed it. For the pilots who flew the D.520, the lesson was personal. They proved that courage and skill were never the issue. For the engineers who built it, the lesson was bitter. Their work was sound, but timing stripped it of meaning. And for the nation that commissioned it, the lesson came too late to be acted upon. History remembers battles and victories. It rarely remembers schedules. Yet schedules decide who arrives first, who adapts, and who is forced to improvise under fire. The Dewoitine D.520 reminds us that in modern war, being right is not enough. Being late turns potential into regret. France built the right aircraft. It simply trusted the wrong clock. and by the time that clock stopped, the sky had already moved on. If this story changed the way you see the fall of France in 1940, leave a comment with your thoughts. History is not just about what happened, but why it happened. Subscribe for more World War II documentaries like this.